Hello, are you just starting with watercolors like me and want to learn some basic techniques? Or maybe you already paint with watercolors but feel like something is missing. If so, this video is for you. Let's explore a few essential techniques together. Thankfully, there are only a few basic techniques that, once mastered, will help both you and me paint confidently with watercolors. These techniques include wet on dry and wet on wet techniques, dry brush, 3 different types of washes, lifting, negative painting, glazing, blooming, and spraying. So let's dive in and practice these techniques together. So let's start by dividing your paper into a few boxes. This will give us space to practice each technique. First, let's try the wet on dry technique. This is the classic technique where the wet watercolor paint is applied to a dry surface. Here you can see I'm painting different flowers and zigzag patterns. If you want to paint another layer or add details, you need to wait until the first layer has completely dried. This technique gives you crisp, defined edges and offers more control over shapes. It's perfect for adding details and creating layers in your artwork. Now let's try the wet on wet technique. Start by wetting the paper with a clean wet brush. Then apply watercolor paint to the wet surface. I'm adding paint before the first color dries, allowing the colors to run together and create soft edges and these beautiful patterns. The key to this technique is keeping the paper surface damp throughout the whole process, so you'll need to work quickly, especially on larger surfaces. This technique creates soft blended edges and natural color transitions, making it ideal for painting skies, water, or abstract backgrounds. Now let's try the dry brush technique. Begin with premixing color and use a brush with minimum water, almost dry, and drag the paint across dry paper. The less water you use, the more saturated and bold the color will appear. For best results, drag the brush at a low angle from left to right to create a ragged edge stroke. If that doesn't work well, try quick brushing from bottom to top. For this technique, I recommend using the thickest part of the brush rather than the tip. This will result in rough, textured strokes that can mimic grass, wood grain, or other textured surfaces. Now let's create a wash. There are 3 types of washes: flat wash, variegated wash, and gradient wash. I will demonstrate all 3. You can apply a wash on dry paper, where you will need to work quickly so the paint doesn't dry and leave harsh edges. Alternatively, you can use the wet on wet technique and apply your wash on wet paper. This works better for large areas like the sky, as it tends to spread more smoothly and evenly. However, be cautious not to use too much water, as it can dilute the effect. For a flat wash, I will use the wet on dry technique, starting by premixing your paint so it's ready to use before you begin. A flat wash uses one consistent color. Here is a useful trick for creating washes. Slightly tilt the top of your paper upward. You can use a book for any support. This helps the paint flow evenly toward the bottom. To create the wash, start with a thin layer of paint and make the first brush stroke from left to right across the top of the paper. Dip your brush into the paint again and create the next line just below the first, overlapping slightly to pick up water from the previous stroke. Repeat this process, working your way down the paper. A flat wash gives you even, consistent color coverage, often used for backgrounds or large areas. To be honest, this technique isn't easy for beginners. It took me several attempts to achieve the right effect. But don't worry, you will use this technique a lot, so it's worth practicing until you feel confident. A gradient wash transitions from dark to light in a single color. To create this wash, I start similarly to a flat wash by premixing the paint, but I make it thicker. The paint is applied in the same manner as a flat wash. The first stroke is painted from left to right. Then I dip the brush into water and into the premixed paint to dilute it slightly before applying the second stroke. Again, from left to right. Each subsequent stroke contains progressively more water until for the final stroke I use only water. At the end, I use a clean dry brush to lift any excess paint. This technique creates seamless transitions, making it ideal for skies and soft backgrounds. Now let's try a variegated wash. A variegated wash uses more than one color, blending them into one another. For this type of wash, the wet-on-wet technique is recommended because it allows the color to blend more smoothly. However, in my attempt, it didn't work as expected. I think I may have added too much water to the paint, or perhaps I should have waited until the water was damp rather than fully wet. As a result, the colors blended unevenly and the blue paint began to run down the paper. So I tried again using the wet-on-dry technique. I started in the same way as with a flat wash. I started with red paint, then after 3 strokes I introduced orange, using this premixing color for the next few strokes. Then I switched to mix of orange and yellow for the next stroke, and finally I used only yellow for the last stroke. As you can see, the yellow blended with the orange on the paper and the final stroke remained a clean yellow. And that's it, we've created a variegated wash. With more practice, I hope to achieve better results with the wet-on-wet technique. But both wet-on-wet and wet-on-dry techniques work, so you can choose whichever suits you best. This wash is perfect for creating beautiful skies or deep seas. The next technique is lifting, and it's quite simple. The goal is to remove color from the paper. To try this, I start by painting a flat wash and then lift the paint by dabbing it with a dry tissue. This technique also works with a clean damped brush, which you can use to wipe away the paint. You can use lifting on wet paint or re-wet a dry area with a stiff brush before lifting the color. At the end of the process, you will achieve highlights that can be used to create fluffy clouds or textured areas. Additionally, this technique is used for making corrections in your work. It works almost like an eraser. Now let's explore negative painting. The goal here is to paint around a subject to make it stand out, rather than painting the subject itself. For this, I've drawn some simple pyramids. I start with a flat wash, and once it's completely dry, I paint the next layer using a deeper tone of the same color, leaving the triangle shapes unpainted. I continue this process with increasingly saturated paint. There are a few tips to make this technique work better. Remember, you are painting the area around the object, not the object itself. Start with lighter colors and gradually move to darker tones. Ensure each layer is completely dry before painting the next one. I learned that impatience can lead to soft or blurred lines if you start a new layer before the previous one is fully dry. This technique works best with a limited palette, and in the end, you will achieve striking contrasts and well-defined shapes. Next, let's look at layering or glazing. This technique involves applying a transparent layer of color over a dried layer of paint to create depth, richer colors, and subtle shifts in tone. You can build multiple layers by glazing one on top of the other. When glazing, it's crucial to let each layer dry completely before applying the next. If you apply a new layer too soon, it can leave the previous layer, causing the pigments to mix. This makes glazing a wet-on-dry technique. Usually we mix colors on a palette before applying them, combining two colors to create a third. Glazing works similarly, but the color mixing happens directly on the paper. Each new layer of paint creates a new color. For example, you can see here where the lines intersected, new colors have formed. Now let's move on to the next technique, called blooming. For this technique, all you need to do is drop wet paint into an already wet area. The result should be spontaneous, organic shapes that resemble blossoms or explosions. However, I think I overdid it in my attempt. I added too many colors and mixed them instead of simply letting the water do the work. I believe the blooming effect worked better in the area where I tested the wet on wet technique. Next is our last and quite fun technique, spraying. For this you simply spray paint using a brush or an old toothbrush. However, I already learned an important lesson while trying this technique. You need to cover all the areas of your painting with paper, except for the section you are working on. This step is crucial to protect other areas from unintended splatters, because you can't fully control where the paint will land. I didn't do this and the paint went beyond the edges and onto another squares. But now we know what not to do. This was such a fun practice session. I hope both you and I feel more confident painting with watercolors after exploring these techniques. Now that we have covered the basics, we can freely experiment and let our creativity flow. And don't forget, the most important rule is to enjoy the process without stressing about perfection. Have fun with painting and keep it light-hearted. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. Happy painting, and I'll see you in the next video.